Thulasizwe Simelane is standing by with our U.S. correspondent, Simon Marks. Thulas, it's his first trip to Africa since leaving office in Washington, D.C., and he's certainly made it a memorable one.
Kathy, and it was a much anticipated address by former President Barack Obama. There were so many expectations that it would signal what he's all about in the post-presidency. And in a moment, I'll be talking to Simon Marks about whether or not we did get those signals that we were looking out for in his speech. But I mean, now the sun is setting over the Wanderers cricket ground here in Ilovo, and if it's been cold throughout the day, you can only imagine what it's going to feel like in the next few minutes. But we're not there just yet because people are still dancing and feeling warm. And a few minutes ago, we did see former President Obama sort of bobbing a little bit and moving his feet just a little bit as if to settle that debate, that banter that started it all, with President Cyril Ramaphosa saying he doesn't think former President Obama can dance as well as the late former President Nelson Mandela, which of course Obama disputed before getting into his speech. A wide-ranging speech, and I'm joined by Simon Marks. And Simon, the sense that I got earlier on, you and I were talking about it, depends on which Obama would come out to speak here today. The sense I got was Obama the idealist, talking about the big ideas of the world and globalization and how the system has perhaps not worked and how it has led to sort of a sense of being hard done by the system, which has fed the strongman politics of today. But also you had an Obama who was actually criticizing and giving a critique of the U.S. leadership without being so overt. Am I correct?
Well, I think so. I mean, I actually think in places this speech was pretty overt. I mean, to a real degree, I think what you got here was the full Obama. He did not hold back, but he combined what I think was really a very clear attack on the Trump administration. That's certainly how it's being viewed now back in Washington, D.C., with his historic worldview. This was, Thulas, as we were noting just before we came on the air, a long speech by Barack Obama, and he went back in history and charted the course of what he described as 100 years of delivering prosperity, taking 1 billion people out of poverty and putting them into the middle class. But then he conceded errors that the international community had made along that journey that, as he put it, gave an opportunity for populists both on the left and the right in the European Union, in the United States and in other parts of the world to move to prominence. He said they undermine every kind of institution. They use barely hidden racism. It turns out, he said, that the recent shift that we're witnessing into reactionary politics proves that the struggle for justice is never really finished. In at least 2 areas, he launched a real attack on Donald Trump, saying that he found it hard to believe that at this point in contemporary society, he needed to stand there and say, facts actually matter. And he spoke of the shame, the rising shame of politicians. He didn't name Donald Trump, but it was absolutely apparent who he meant, who were caught in a lie and then doubled down and lied again. He said he could find common ground, for instance, with people who disagreed with the Paris climate change accords because of the minutiae of the detail, but he could not find common ground with people like Donald Trump, he didn't use his name, who deny the existence of climate change. And finally, there was a blistering attack on President Trump's immigration policies, again, not by name. And for President Obama, this issue of immigration is difficult because he was accused of being the deporter-in-chief. He deported millions of illegal immigrants during his presidency. He defended his right and the right of others to say, look, borders matter, laws matter. But he said that doesn't mean you have to approach the issue of immigration without any sense of humanity in the implementation of those policies. That's a clear slap at what's going on in Washington, D.C.
So, Simon, given what you just said, we were looking looking out for various messages on a global stage, and indeed we did get that in as far as the critique of the global system of governance and the systems that we have built up over the last 25 to 30 years or so. But in the US, how do you think this has been received? How do you think it's going to be reported as it hears?
Well, it is already being reported. The Associated Press has put out a slew of news alerts. Associated Press being an American-based news agency, reporting precisely what Barack Obama had to say, particularly about what he argued was the shame of those politicians who lie relentlessly, clearly meaning Donald Trump. But there was a universal message in this. To people around the world, he was saying it's time, if you want to deliver social justice, if you want to deliver economic prosperity, that doesn't mean that the wealthiest have a disproportionate degree of power and influence in global societies, then as he put it, you've got to build and innovate. Now that's a universal message, but it's also a message, I think, very, very clearly directed at members of his own Democratic Party in the United States. There will be Democrats in the United States who will watch this speech over the next few hours in America and who will hope that this is the beginning of Barack Obama's re-emergence, not just on the international stage, but on the American political stage. There will be Democratic candidates in House and Senate races all over America who tonight will go to bed desperately hoping that Barack Obama joins them on the campaign trail and makes that speech to fire up their supporters before the midterm elections in America this November.
Sure. So also along those lines of, talking about the global system of governance and how it has failed in some instances, he then talked about some of the mistakes that were made, and he mentioned the issue of Iraq and says that, the pushback when the global system failed some people and failed to change their lived circumstances. Part of the pushback included a perversion of one of the greatest religions, in his words, that being Islam, which then manifests in, international terrorism. But also he then said America's invasion of Iraq also didn't help. That's not necessarily a new thing, is it? But has he ever stated it like that?
Well, no, I think he has stated that before, although not necessarily in terms quite as stark as that. He also confronted an area in which he's also got some personal political difficulty in terms of his legacy. He said that he believed that the reforms that he had introduced after the 2008 recession, which he blamed for fueling the rise of a whole variety of movements, including, of course, Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, but also the populist movements of the right and left that he was referencing. He said that he believed that the reforms that he'd introduced had helped to try and correct the disparities that he was talking about. But, his critics will say, come on, Mr. President, you didn't jail a single banker in the United States on your watch. You didn't go nearly far enough in terms of trying to correct the issues that led to that economic collapse in 2008. So, there were claims that he was making that I think that some of his detractors would take some issue with. But ultimately what he was doing, I think, was trying to ignite the hopes and fears of people who he said mustn't give in to cynicism at this time of tremendous difficulty for those people who don't share the worldview of men and women like Donald Trump. And as he was talking, let me also tell you that back in Washington, a growing number of Republicans are now coming out and publicly criticizing President Trump over the events of the last 24 hours in Helsinki. And I don't think you can completely divorce the timing of this speech and the things he had to say from what are now very voluble political times back in the United States.
Right, Kathy and Vuyo, it's getting quite loud at the Wanderers at the moment. I mean, just a few minutes ago, you could hear Thandiswa Mazwai and the Soweto Gospel Choir in the background, sort of giving their musical items there. And I can tell you, it's almost as if with the floor where we are sitting was sort of of shaking a little bit as people, for a change now, sort of as they go through what they've heard throughout this afternoon, are taking a moment to just relax and enjoy some dancing at the end of this day. And we've just been going through what President Obama had to say, but also there were other interesting speeches that were delivered. I mean, President Cyril Ramaphosa spoke about how Mandela challenges all of us to go beyond, what we think are barriers at the moment, and actually continue to strive and push for a better South Africa. And then said there are times when he feels that he can hear the word of former President Nelson Mandela saying to him, I've sent you to serve the people, and saying that the call to Tumamina, send me, is a call that is from Madiba himself. And of course, who can forget, Kathy and Vuyo, the speech delivered by Graça Machel, which I thought was quite interesting in that she sought to actually take the challenge and throw it at young South Africans, some of whom we all know have been quite critical of what has been achieved as a legacy of the work that was done by the country's founding fathers, the country's founders, including Nelson Mandela, in that some young people feel that it has let them down, in that it has not led to socio-economic justice. The message was clear from Graça Machel, I thought, was to say that what Mandela did and his generation did was to give you a basis from which to work, to strive for that socio-economic justice. So all round, it's really been an intellectually edifying day here. We've listened to some pretty interesting speeches that have been delivered here, including, of course, that keynote address by former US President Barack Obama.